Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this AxioWorks event. My name is Francesco. I am a CEO of Axio.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Rupert Squires. I'm the Client Director of Information XP. We are a SharePoint consultancy. And the reason I'm here today is that we see a lot of the challenges that AxioWorks solves. And that's why I thought I could probably bring some perspective of what our clients are facing and maybe provide some context. So I thought it might be useful today.
Excellent. So just to start with, a few words about the webinar. So who is this webinar for? Business system architects, BI analysts, reporting analysts. If you are a data analyst, basically everyone that handles data within an organization, and especially when you have multiple systems and you handle the entirety of the data across all the systems. In terms of platform, the solution we are going to show is based on the SharePoint Online or on-prem. And in terms of database, we use a SQL Server database, either a SQL Azure on the cloud or SQL Server on-prem. Now, what are we going to see today? First, we think that there is a problem with SharePoint that we are going to describe. And we are going to show how we use our product SQList to solve this problem. We are going to show also a few use cases of actual implementation of SQList that shows a different situation, how they were solved using the product. And we're going to have some time for some questions. But please, if you have questions, also add them in the chat, and then we'll do our best to answer them as we go. So what is the problem with SharePoint? For this phase, I'm gonna hand over to you, Rupert, as you have experienced this situation on multiple occasions. So I'll leave this slide to you.
Okay, so my business, we work solely in consulting on Microsoft SharePoint, and the reason that people like it is that it has a lot of things baked in. It has things like approvals, it has version control, it's got security and security trimming built in, and it becomes a familiar interface if you're using SharePoint, maybe for your intranet and your document management. Now, one of the challenges with SharePoint now is you're creating all this data, and we've got both maybe data in lists, maybe a client list or a product list, but also we're creating documents, so maybe knowledge management, knowledge documents, for example, and it tends to sit within SharePoint, and it's quite hard to get out. And more recently, companies are now using SharePoint or SharePoint Microsoft Lists to store data from maybe Power-Ups that they're creating. But the data they're creating, they want to use elsewhere, either because they want to pull it into maybe a Power BI report and they want to pull that data from SharePoint and other systems together, or that we want to start doing more complicated SQL queries against maybe multiple lists of data in SharePoint. Or, we see this a lot where organizations create data maybe in SharePoint but want it to appear in their line of business systems, but there's not easy ways to join them together. And then looking forward, I think AI is going to play an interesting part, and because of that, we've actually got a should we say a use case where AI might become useful into querying SharePoint data. So these are some of the challenges that we've come up with and we've seen. And when we talked about these with Francesco, he said, well, actually, I've seen these before with some of my clients, so let me take you through those. And I think that's what we're going to do today, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And just to name a few of these issues that we have with SharePoint, everybody is familiar with the 5,000 item limit. Limit on the number of lookups that you can retrieve from SharePoint, and performance in general, also with SharePoint, particularly on SharePoint Online when you encounter issues like throttling. And in general, you cannot actually query multiple lists and join together and perform powerful queries on this data. So how do we see a solution for this problem? Well, we have a product called SQList, and what does that do? SQList sits in between SharePoint and SQL Server, and it keeps in sync the data from the SharePoint lists and libraries as a SQL Server table on the destination database. Any change made in SharePoint is automatically replicated to SQL Server so that you have the data available directly as SQL tables. Once the data is in SQL Server, you can connect virtually any reporting or BI tool to query this data. As well, you can perform all the queries that you can perform across all the data. And also, if you have other systems that have data in SQL Server, you can actually put this data all together and have basically the entirety of your database available as SQL tables. We are going to see now a few use cases where this solution was applied, and so that you can see also additional uses that you can use SharePoint in these situations. So let's start with the first use case. In this case here, this is a client of ours that had a number of systems in their organizations that were storing data in SQL Server databases. What happens, a common scenario when a company has multiple systems running is that there are some data that are in common. So for example, in this case, there are two systems, one for invoicing and one for supply chain management, and they both had the product tables. What was the problem here? That when there was a new product had to be created in both systems. Sometimes, in some cases, these updates are done manually. So somebody actually goes in one system and then the other, and then update the table. Or a common scenario is also that custom jobs are created to keep in sync the data between the various systems. There are some complexity with these solutions because when you have changes on multiple systems, it becomes very difficult to work out which one came first, which one came after, and also which one is the most reliable data. So what did we do in this case? In this case, the company had the SharePoint in-house already. So what we did, we created a product list in SharePoint with all the data necessary to both systems. We used SQList to replicate this data as a SQL Server table. And then we created some views on the SQL Server tables that matched exactly the table name and the table structure of the various systems. Once we had that, we were able to simply repoint the various systems to the views, and so that there was no downtime on the systems at all. And there was only one source of data at that point. In fact, an important thing that we introduced with this solution was that we introduced a single version of the truth for the product list. So there was no confusion anymore about who was making the changes and where. And also, we introduced a single point of access. So very easy to control who's got access, all permissions on the list, and control basically the access to this data. And we are going to see a demo of this now. So let's switch over to a SharePoint site. Over here, we have a SharePoint online list called products. You can see that there are several columns here that we display. On this machine, we have a SQList running, and it's keeping the data in sync to a local database as SQL Server table. Over here, we have the database. If I run this select over here, you see that we have this is just the top 10 of the products that match the products that we have in the SharePoint site over here. So let's see what happens when I create a new product on this table, for example. So I go here, I create a new one. I'm going to call it webinar screen, for example. I give it a unique price. 1,500, maybe we have 5 in stock. I can select the category here. And then we save the item. Now, this change is done on the SharePoint site. Now, SQList is running in the background. If we switch over to the SQL table and we do a refresh, we give it a couple of seconds. Let me just... apologies for this. I did a small mistake.
That's the joy of live demos. So you know
the live demo,
real.
yes,
Nothing's
that
recorded.
is the live demo. So over here we have the webinar screen that came straight into the table. If we go back to the SharePoint site and we do an update, for example, and I'm going to change the price, for example, to 5,000. Again, SQList in the background keeps all the data in sync. And in a moment, you will see that the data comes, there you go, almost instantaneously, the data is replicated to the SQL Server table. And this is what SQList does in a nutshell. In the example that I gave over here, in the use case, what we did then, we took the table, we created the views, and we basically used the views to feed to the various systems that we use in the product table. Okay.
Francesco, I mean, that looked amazing. From what I saw there is that, firstly, it was almost instantaneous, you know, maybe a couple of seconds here or there from putting something into SharePoint. You didn't have to go and manually kick off any jobs, kick off any Power Automates or anything like that, which made it super quick. Another nice thing I saw being a SharePoint person is it pulled the calculated fields across. Anyone who works in SharePoint knows that calculated fields can be a little bit difficult. So that was really cool too. And I imagine the same happens if we were to delete a record, almost instantaneous as well. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we can see that in action. We can go here and remove this item here. I'm going to delete it from the database. And if we go back to our select, give it a couple of seconds, and you will see that the table will. There you go. The screen is gone also from the SQL Server table.
Okay, I mean, that looked amazing. I guess the things that obviously, you know, I've got a whole load of fields in SharePoint. Have I got to then create these fields in my SQL database so they match exactly what's in SharePoint, make sure I've got the right types? I imagine that takes some time to set up. Is that right?
Actually, SQList synchronizes the data as well as the structure of the list, Rupert. So what happens is that if you go to the list and you create a new column, SQList will pick up this change and automatically add the column to the table. The same if you remove the column, it will go and drop the column from the table. In fact, one advantage of SQList is that when you want to start replicating your tables, you don't need to create the table or do any mapping. You simply select the list that you want to export, and then you let SQList create the tables and all the columns. In fact, it takes literally minutes to have your data from SharePoint available to SQL Server.
So basically, I can start with the SQList service, an empty database, pointed to my SharePoint server, and I'm off.
And off you go. Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. Cool. Okay, I think you've got another demo for us, but that was,
yes.
I mean, the speed of that I think was the most impressive thing. Anyone who's had to wait for Power Automate to do its thing will be impressed by that.
Excellent. Okay, next demo. So in here, in this use case, we had, well, these customers had a live website. And what they were doing, this website was, the content for this website was fed from data stored in a SQL Server. They had also a replica of the system for a staging website. And what they were doing, they were first updating data on the staging database so that they could preview all the changes on the staging website. Then somebody in the organization would check the changes and approve and approve them to go live. Then, through some semi-manual jobs, this data from the staging database were replicated over to the live database so that they will become available on the live site. Let's say the problem with this solution was what? First, the manual intervention for the migration from staging to live, but also the fact that using these steps, because it was a semi-automated process, there were possibilities for mistakes made for the data to go live. How did we solve this situation? Again, the company had SharePoint in-house, and so what we did, we created in SharePoint a series of lists and libraries for the content that was to be published to the website. We then installed SQList and configured it to export pending data onto the SQL Server or the staging SQL Server database, and the approved data to the live SQL Server database. One thing I need to add is that in SharePoint, we also enabled content approval, so that when you make a change, the content goes into pending before it gets approved. The staging and live websites kept pointing to the same databases, and so that they would see each the staging or live site. With this process, then the person responsible for the approval would then check the website in staging, and if happy with the changes, simply go into SharePoint, approve the content, and automatically SQList would get the approved content and push it over to the live database. At this point, the live website displayed the approved content without any interventions, any manual intervention to push the data live. Let's take a look at this in an example. So we are going back to our site. So over here, we have a simple list. I created this just for the demo. It's called recipes. There is only one item in it. And you can see here that there is only one item, and it's currently is approved, because in this list we enabled the content approval. If we now go to the database, in here I have a select of two tables. You see that there is a table that we call staging recipes. This is coming from the SQList replication that replicates pending data. And then we have a live recipes table, which comes from the replication of SQList that replicates approved data. At the moment, the data is the same on both tables because the content is approved in SharePoint. If we go to our list here and we edit this item, let's change this chocolate from light to heavy. And we give it a few more calories, for example. Now we save the data. We see that the approval status go to pending. So this data at the moment, we want to see this data only on the staging database. If we go here and we rerun the two selects, here you can see that the first table, which is the staging one, contains the pending data. So the website that would point to this database would display this data, the staging site, but the production data is still the approved one. Once we are happy with the changes and everything looks good, all we need to do is go back to SharePoint and approve this data. So I select approval over here. And if we go back to the database, we give it a refresh, and there you can see that the data already has been replicated to the live site. And this is basically what we did in the situation. And by using the built-in, the out-of-the-box approval in SharePoint, we actually were able to build a quite powerful system that allowed to preview the changes before we actually want to send them live.
Francesco, I mean, that looks so cool. I think what I really liked about it was that you're using the out-of-the-box SharePoint there. There's no clever wizardry, but if you had maybe a multi-stage approval process, you could use Power Automate to do that. A question for you. Obviously, this is showing a list item. Often when we're trying to push documents, particularly to websites, I know we've got some engineering clients who push out specification documents or data sheets. How would that work for a PDF, for example?
It would work more or less in the same way. SQList can export documents contained in document libraries, and it exports them as a blob, so binary columns in the SQL table. Once they are in the SQL table, if this data is served through a website, it's actually very simple to just connect, serve a document from a blob. It's literally a couple of lines of code. The advantage of this approach is that you don't need to link back to the document in SharePoint, which usually is not available from a public website, but you would serve it directly from your site.
I think the other thing is that often the content is created in SharePoint for websites, and then somebody has to cut and paste it and push it across particular documents and move those manually. So having both the publishing process and the approval process and just using out-of-the-box tools, I think ticks a lot of boxes.
Excellent.
Now, you did talk about a few other scenarios. So this could also work for reporting. It could work for line of business systems. Maybe if you're updating your categories on a line of business system, you might want to do this first, check it works, check everything's correct, and before you then put approvals piece. So, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the last thing worth just saying is, because we're using that approval process in SharePoint, you've got an audit log now of who's approved what and when. And let's say there were 10 documents and you approved 5 and rejected the other 7, then using the logic, it's only going to push to 3. There's no risk that the other 7 get moved across manually by by human interaction. So
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of wins there. That's super interesting. Cool. I think you've got another use case for us though.
Yes, let's move on and let's go to the next one. So in this case here, okay, this is probably the most common use of a SQList because it solves probably the most common problem with SharePoint. In here, we had a client who had many lists, and many of these lists were very large, some 10 million plus items. So what is the problem with that? When you have this kind of very large list, it becomes difficult to manage them in SharePoint itself because you have to start creating views and filters in order to actually be able to view the items. But also, in this case, they wanted to generate some Power BI reports that from the data stored in SharePoint. And that was basically impossible because in Power BI, getting the data from SharePoint, it meant importing every time all this data, which was very, very long. And in fact, actually, it didn't actually work. So what we did in this case, we put SQList in between. So rather than going from SharePoint to Power BI, we went from SharePoint to SQList and therefore to SQL Server. Once the data was in SQL Server, the client was able to create reports directly from this data. An additional advantage of this solution was that they were able to connect the Power BI with direct query connections to the data rather than importing the data. What does it mean? That means that Power BI sends the query for the data directly to the source, in this case to SQL Server, and only retrieves the data that it needs. This gives a huge performance increase when you generate the reports. Let's take a look at this case. So we're going back to our SharePoint site. We have here a list called Big List. This doesn't contain 10 million items. It contains only a few 100,000, I think. But a couple of things to note here is that we have all these items, and each item belongs to a group, like group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they have a current stock. This list is being kept in sync by SharePoint, by SQList in the background. And we have here a Power BI report that reads the data from the table. Over here, we have live big list. This is the SQL table that is fed by SQList. In this case here, we refresh the data, and we see that currently group 4 is the one with the highest value. Let's go and make a change in SharePoint and see what happens. If I go here and I take, for example, this product here that belongs to group 3, and I add it, and I call it 5 million. I'll give it a current a stock of 5 million, just to make sure that it pops up to the top as the highest value. So we refresh this data, we change this data, SQList in the background is doing its job, and because we have a live, a direct query connection, if we refresh our data, you see that now, immediately, you could see that it was literally instantaneous for group 3 to become the highest value. So what is this? That means that you can create Power BI reports on data that are live, on SharePoint data that are live. So you don't need to, for example, import all the data, refresh, regenerate the report. That, with large amount of data, can either take very long time or actually not work at all. One additional advantage of direct connection, you can see the speed of refresh is literally a second, if not less. And if we...
I mean, that looks pretty cool. I've just got a question there before you carry on. Is obviously, in that case, you pulled data from SharePoint. I imagine you could then join that with data from other sources which are sitting on that SQL server, so we can do some table joins if my SQL is correct there,
Absolutely.
and produce other reports.
Absolutely. And in fact, that is one of the main advantages of SQList is it allows you to integrate with other systems. So you have this data in SharePoint, you have data from another system, put them all together, maybe in a view in SQL Server, join them all together, do all the heavy queries in there, and then generate the report directly from the data.
And then for those people who like to get their hands dirty and write a bit of transact SQL, they can do that as well. They can just go like you did in your query window there and just, yeah.
Once the data is in SQL Server, we say the sky is the limit because you can literally do everything you want.
Now, I've got some clients who have, just because of either they've gone on acquisition trails or they've just over this period of time, they've got both SharePoint Online and they've got SharePoint On-Prem, and they've probably got different versions of SharePoint On-Prem. How does SQList work with that? Do I need to create separate instances for SQList to do that, or?
Well, you just need to create what we call different replications. A replication means that you select some list from one site and push them to a SQL Server database. You can create multiple ones that points to different SharePoint sites that can be online and on-prem. So you can mix all these different environments and replicate them all to the same database. At that point, you have one database with all the tables where you can then basically use the data in their entirety.
Oh, wow. So for those companies who are going through transition and saying, well, actually, I need to pull all this data together, which is often a manual task, we can automate that.
Yes, absolutely.
And obviously, with my SharePoint hat on, you can embed your Power BI report back into SharePoint using the Power BI web part. So you've got the full circle there.
Yes,
of
exactly.
Giving data to people where they want to consume it, but you're pulling it from all sources together.
And
That's
live,
great.
yeah.
Cool. Okay. Any more demos?
Let's move on. Next use case. Okay, this one is actually a prototype that we're building. And what do we do here? In SharePoint, SharePoint is used very much to store documents. It's very powerful document management system for knowledge, for contracts, for policies, and anything. What happens there is that then there are some search features that you can go and search for this document, but it's basically, what it is basically a keyword search. You need to put some keywords, you get a list of documents, open these documents and see which one actually answer the question that you want to ask. So what did we do here? We integrated the output generated by SQList with this new tool that we're building, which uses the power of OpenAI, so that we were able to give a feature to query information about the documents in the document library, as in the same way that you do with ChatGPT. So you don't have to actually look for a list of documents and then check which document has the information you look for. But basically, you just ask a question, and the system answers it for you. We have a demo of this system as well. So let's switch over here. So over here we have a document library that actually Rupert kindly provided for this demo. Maybe Rupert, I'll leave it to you to explain.
Yeah, sure. So why don't you click on the word Policies Hub there? So what we're looking at here is an Information EXP test environment or demo environment where we demo our Policy Express solution, which helps companies manage the full life cycle of their policies, from creation to approval processes to attestation, so people sign up saying they understand them. But then the bit after that is people be able to go back and find those policies and maybe feedback on them. And so when it comes to finding policies, typically we deliver this, I'd say, Amazon type search experience where you've got you put your terms at the top, or you can use filters on the left-hand side. So this kind of relies on a couple of things. One, breaking policies down into bite-sized chunks so they are digestible, and B, broadly knowing what you're looking for. But as we can tell from the growth of ChatGPT, people want to start using natural language, and that was the driver behind, I guess, this idea that Francesco's pulled together. So, Francesco, at this stage, if we look at the process, someone's created a Word document as a policy, it's been approved, and it's then been published into the hub here. And as part of that process, actually, it's been converted into PDF. So
Correct.
what I'd like to do, I mean, a question I might want to know, or maybe not me, but somebody might want to know, say, what is the policy on maternity leave, or how long do I get take off for maternity leave? That might be a question I want to ask.
So to do this, we're going to use this this window here. We have built a kind of chat system that we can use to inquire, to ask a question to this system. So, sorry, can you tell me the question again, Rupert?
How long do I get off for maternity leave?
Do I get off, do you say?
Yeah.
Maternity leave.
Perfect.
Okay, so what this system does now, it goes and query search the information in the document, in Rupert's document library, and it will answer only with information that it finds in there. Let's give it a couple of seconds. There we go. It says the duration of the maternity leave is 52 weeks. And it also says that you have 20 split in two, one for ordinary maternity leave and one for additional maternity leave. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think, let's try another question. What is the company pension contribution?
Okay.
And the reason we use these use cases is because when we're delivering projects, this tends to be one of the first things which gets turned on as part of an intranet, which is how can we publish the policies so everyone's got that single version of the truth.
Yeah. Just one thing I wanted to show is that the system also returns the original document where the information was retrieved. So you can always go into the document and checks if you want to look for more information about it. Let's go back to the system. And so how much the company, did you say?
Yeah, how much does the company contribute to my pension?
How much does the company contribute to my pension? Okay. Take a look.
Now, why this is working, I think what's interesting is, oh, there we go. So
okay,
what I like about this is it's not making stuff up. It's not going off to the internet to say, well, the legal minimum is X. It's just simply being saying we don't have that information. And I think there's a reason for that, isn't there, Francesco?
Is the document present in the library?
Well, I think that's it. So if we go back to the document hub.
Yeah, let me just get
the policy sub there on the top left.
Yeah, let me just find. I can't find it. Let me just get it back.
You right on the PDF window. If you go back to the PDF window, open that, then click on.
There we go. Yeah, well done.
So under the administration, we have something called document masters. So masters is just below you there, and these are the Word documents where this content has been done. So has been created, and as you can see, these are Word documents rather than PDFs because we convert them as part of a process. So on that first document there at the top, we've got the general information, which I happen to know has the pension information, which we haven't published it yet. So if you just want to click on that one, Francesco, number 63, and go to automate. And then there is something called force publish. Now, in reality, this would go through an approval process. Force publish. And we just get that power automate kicking up in the background. This would go through an approval process, maybe 2 steps, normally to a subject matter expert, and then maybe to a quality controller. So that's what would normally happen. Obviously, for the sake of a demo, we're not here to demonstrate the workflow, but we're here to demonstrate the ability of the AI to scan new documents.
Just let me see.
We might just kick that off again. I think we're having the joys of tech. So yes, DMS, force publish, and then hopefully that will bring up the approval.
There we go.
There you go. So just pick a date, any date in the future. For the sake of this. Other things that you might notice here is the document's been categorized. It's also got a document number there, which has been generated automatically by the system. So it's got the company name, the department, ops, letter P for policy, and then the next number in that sequence, which is 15. And you can see already it's gone orange for next review date because Francesco only set it 2 weeks in the future. So whoever's managing these policies is going to worry about that. Now, behind the scenes, if we go back to the Policy Hub administration and then click on the documents, hopefully that will be published as a PDF, which will either maybe appear at the top or the bottom of that list, I suspect.
It's there. It's already in there.
Okay, there you can see a few seconds ago, that has just been popped in there. And if you just click on that document, Francesco, if you just scroll down a bit, we should see some information about pension, and then we'll go and see if that actually matches. There you go, pension scheme. Yeah, so we've got some information and we can see the answer is 5%. So what will be interesting now to see is how quickly that's been integrated by SQList and how quickly it's been indexed by AI. And then we run that search. Let's see what happens.
Well, the system is currently running, so let's go back to our assistant, AI assistant, and let's ask the question again. So if I take this question and ask it again, and I keep my fingers very crossed, we just give it a few seconds and let's see whether the new document has been. There we go. Okay, as we can see, we can get a different answer this time. And in fact, it says that the company matches any contribution up to 5% of your personal pay. So as you can see, the system, because SQList is in the background that keeps all the data in sync, plus we paired it with this new addition that feed the AI model, this is a very powerful tool to actually query look for information in your libraries without having anymore to go and search for document and try to find the right answer. As always, you always have the link to the source of the information. So if you actually look at it, here we go. This is the same document that we're looking. So you can always go there and either just confirm just in case, or look for additional information and do anything you need to do.
I think the other great use case for this, I know this is sort of experimental at the moment, is knowledge management.
Yes.
So a lot of people put things in their company knowledge bases. It's often not indexed or categorized very well. Maybe the information sits across multiple documents. I think this has got a great use case. And the other thing, which is probably worth highlighting, is when people look at ChatGPT, they're really clear on, this data is not current. This data is, from as a cutoff point about 18 months, 2 years ago. Whereas what we're showing here is this is what live straight up. As soon as you add the content, it's pretty much indexed straight away. Francesco, I think that was a great use case. Was anything else that you wanted to add? But
okay, no. Well, this the only thing I wanted to add is that these windows that we're looking at the moment is actually just a UI to the system. But we are actually planning to evolve this into an embedded experience without SharePoint, so that you don't need to actually get out to SharePoint to get the information. Apologies. Okay, this brings us to the last demo. Let me go back to our slides, which are. I seems to have lost the slides. It's over here. There we go. So this brings us to the last of our demo. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll just go through just a few facts about SharePoint, about SQList. First, in a few words, what does SQList do? SQList synchronizes the data from SharePoint listed library and makes them available as a SQL Server table, so that you don't need to connect to SharePoint to retrieve this data, but you connect directly to SQL Server. In terms of platform, it supports all versions of SharePoint on-prem from 2010 onwards, as well as SharePoint Online, and Microsoft SQL Server from 2008 onwards, as well as SQL Azure in the cloud. SQList is licensed per installation. You install SQList on one machine, and one installation can connect to multiple SharePoint sites. The license is perpetual, and it includes also the first year of support and upgrades. After that, we have an optional plan if you want to keep up with support and update that you can subscribe. In terms of specs for the machines, SQList is requires very little resources. So if you already have a service machine, you can install it there. If you want to install it on its own machine, just a simple VM will do just fine. The price of SQList currently is £4,500, and which is about $6,000.
Perfect.
And
Francesco, I have one question for you, which has popped up. Is SQList a one-way push from SharePoint to SQL, or will it push back from SQL back into SharePoint?
SQList is only one way. So the goal of SQList is to make the data that you store in SharePoint available, and that is stored. So it doesn't replicate back to SharePoint. It's only a one-way replication.
Perfect. Okay. Actually, I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. So, and I think, it was really comprehensive there. I think one of the things that we talked about offline was, how low spec is a low spec VM if you were to put it in Azure, and we're talking what, $50 a month, something like that. It's so low powered.
Absolutely, a very small machine. Nowadays, I mean, a couple of gigs of RAM is more than enough. But as I was saying, that is if you actually want to install it on its own machine. Otherwise, if you had already a machine installed there, it will be absolutely fine.
The other thing worth highlighting is, a lot of solutions these days, they're all based on how much you use them. Whereas this solution, particularly if you're trying to do financial budgeting, you know what you're going to pay. It doesn't matter if you, sync 1 million rows or 20 million rows every day. It doesn't make any difference. The cost is going to be the same, which I think, in these days, that's a bit of a blessing. I know that Microsoft try and charge you for every transaction. So, that's another win. So, Francesco, look, if this makes sense to people, what should they do next?
Okay. First, you can go to our website and you can download a 30-day trial of the software if you want to try, completely free, and that will allow you to explore all the functionalities of SQList. If you want to contact us, please contact us at info@axioworks.com, and you can also find us on LinkedIn, where we published and Twitter, where we published all our updates regularly. If you have any question about the demo, or if you download the trial and you have you need any assistance with it, just contact us and we'll be back to you right away.
Perfect.
Okay.
I mean, that sounds great. Really enjoyed watching that and seeing that in action. I think it's got so many use cases.
Excellent. Well, I think that this brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you for coming, and everybody have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye.